For more on businesses in the UK returning to work, my colleague Rochelle Akufo spoke to Helen Thomas. She's CEO and founder of Blonde Money. Rochelle began by asking her how much of an impact reopening non-essential retailers will really have toward reigniting the UK economy.
Well, it's certainly going to help to reopen as much as possible because there has been such a huge economic hit from the lockdown. But really, it's kind of a drop in the ocean because it has been such a dramatic fall in the growth rate. So it needs to happen. It's going to help, but it's, I think, not going to be enough.
So then some people are saying, obviously it's still just a start at this point, but it's also an opportunity for retail to rebuild. But as we mentioned, we're seeing UK stocks falling even as shoppers are hitting the high street. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think overall we have to look at the context of global stock markets, which have had a huge rally since the lows in the end of March, April, when, of course, the world's policymakers injected so much money into the system. But I think that when we look at the specifics of retailers, particularly in the UK, we need to look at their online presence. I mean, that is going to be quite an important decider as to whether some of these businesses can survive, because consumers, frankly, they don't want to go back to the shops.
And so it's interesting because we saw that Prime Minister Boris Johnson recently said that people should shop and shop with confidence. But obviously that's easier said than done. We've got the coronavirus in many parts of the world starting to re-spike as places have started to reopen. And obviously people have different levels of risk tolerance. So what is going to be the key to really instilling that confidence?
Well, I mean, that is the really big question for policymakers around the world. And I think that we will all have to be used to a lower level of activity as people are still very scared. Fear casts a long shadow. And when we look at what that actually means for shops, I was really struck by Harrods, the iconic London store. At the weekend, their chief executive said, they were ready to reopen today, but they would only really, because of the new distancing measures, they could only have 4,500 shoppers in the store. That compares to 70,000 that they used to have on a good day. So, if that's something that's such a problem for a store like Harrods, then you can see that could be quite a problem for many other shops.
And you can understand what sort of, trickle-down problems that might come with, because you're partially reopening, but you obviously still need staff for all these stores. Now, we're seeing that experts are saying that the British economy is likely to shrink by 8% this year, unlikely to recover from the damage from the coronavirus until 2023. Other estimates are even having it as high as a 14% contraction. What are your thoughts?
I think there is no question this is the worst recession of our lifetimes, and not just in the UK, obviously globally. Now, when it comes to Britain is, particularly much more worse off than anywhere else, it's frankly going to depend on the behaviours we talked about. How much more does a British consumer feel safe compared to French or American or, of course, someone over in Asia? That's going to be part of it. But part of it is the structure of the economy, because with this big structural shift that we've had, that's going to see a benefit for technology companies, of course. So countries that have a bigger tech presence, that part of the economy may ultimately do very well.
Now, obviously, a lot of people looking for a light at the end of the tunnel. Unfortunately, sometimes the light is just another oncoming train, and I mean that in terms of Brexit, obviously. We saw that on Friday that the UK had formally rejected the option to extend the Brexit deadline for transition past the end of the year, leaving companies with really just a few months to prepare, while we're also going through a pandemic and these obviously restrictive lockdowns. How do you think all this is going to impact the UK's ability then to bounce back from this in the short to longer term?
Well, Brexit, of course, is primarily a UK-EU issue. And so it will depend on how sectors of our economy, what do they require from Europe if we were to go into next year without some kind of free trade deal. But I would also go back to, this being a global shock. Everyone was very concerned about a no-deal Brexit, but given that countries have closed their borders and we've seen a grounding of aeroplanes globally, we've kind of had a no-deal Brexit all over the world, which is obviously why it's so dramatically bad. that means to some degree that people have already adjusted in Britain and the EU to this shock, such that an extra purely Brexit issue may be somewhat more minimized. And so I think, Brexit is still obviously a dominating factor in terms of what happens to the British economy, but I would just say we are in a multi-year, multi-country framework now for trade deals. It's not just UK v EU. The whole world is having to renegotiate its supply chains. And so that'll be taking place whatever happens with Brexit.